Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to the seminar entitled Bodhisattva Dharmakara, Avatar of the Pure Land. I am Reverend Peter Hata, and first of all, I want to, of course, also thank the Higashi Honganji North America District for sponsoring this seminar, and also Reverend Osa for actually inviting me. So I really appreciate that. And Reverend Olson and I were hoping that today's seminar could have been, held as a hybrid event with some, online, and at least some of you in person. But as we say in Buddhism, impermanence, had other plans. But it's really great to see all of you, and hopefully, we will be able to meet in person again someday, somewhere. But I think we can still enjoy our gathering today, as Bishop Ito said. There are certain advantages and certain things that we can do with this technology, and so hopefully I'll try to use some of those things today, and I hope that you enjoy it. Well, as you I think may have heard from Elsie, she was breaking up a little bit, but basically at about the 1 hour point, or maybe give or take 5 minutes, we'll take a short break, and I would suggest 5 minutes, and just time for you to take care of business and then come back as soon as possible. And then we'll start a Q&A session. And I'd like to keep the Q&A session relatively short, like maybe 15 minutes, which means I probably won't be able to answer all of your questions. But if you put your question in the chat, I should have your email, and I will be sure to respond to you via email. So don't hesitate asking a question in the chat. And then after that Q&A, we'll have a music segment. And I think regarding the music segment, I'm going to play some songs, which I've chosen because of their basic resonance with the Buddhist teachings. The Buddhist teachings that I will have discussed in my lecture. So my hope is that when we listen to these songs together, that we'll all appreciate their resonance with the Buddhist teachings. And actually, hopefully we'll have time in this music segment so that it won't be just me playing them, but we'll have time to have a little bit of interaction. And I'm looking forward to I'm very interested in hearing what your interpretations of these songs are. So that's after the break and after the Q&A a little bit later. Okay, well, to begin, let me first acknowledge, I think as some of you already know, the title of this talk is a little unusual. I don't think I've ever seen the word avatar in any lecture on Dharmakara or on the Pure Land, but in its general sense of referring, to someone or something that stands in for and embodies an ideal quality or truth, I think this is an important word. And this is because what I'd like to share with you today is my appreciation of our Pure Land tradition and what I think is the universal path to enlightenment or awakening that it offers. But over the years, I've come to realize that most people's appreciation of Pure Land Buddhism seems to benefit from digging just a little bit more deeply into its historical roots. And as I think we'll see, understanding this word avatar, or actually as scholars might say, upaya, or expedient means, I think understanding this word is a key to unlocking what Pure Land Buddhism, and actually what the Pure Land itself, I think, offers us. So regarding the term avatar, or as I mentioned, the more commonly used term, a Sanskrit term, upaya, which I think many of you have heard, this term can be difficult to understand in Pure Land Buddhism, but I want to give you a couple of down-to-earth examples of avatars upaya, so that you can kind of maybe get a little more familiar with it if you're not already familiar with it. So the first term that I heard was used by, ironically, or strangely enough, or coincidentally, Reverend Marvin Harada, who Bishop Ito mentioned. Reverend Marvin Harada is the Bishop of the Buddhist Churches of America, and several years ago, he was giving a talk on the subject of the larger sutra. And coincidentally, like me, he was also discussing the story of Bodhisattva Dharmakara, the central character in the larger sutra who, eventually becomes Amida Buddha. And as I think we know, Amida Buddha is, of course, the Buddha on our temple altars. And this sutra, the largest sutra or sermon of the Buddha, is considered the most important in Pure Land Buddhism. But I think, all of us, or most of us, I think, know that the story in the sutra is not actually historically true. In other words, it's a mythical story. But I think what Reverend Harada wanted to point out is that just because a story is a myth doesn't mean it's of less value. And to make his point, he surprised all of us by discussing another myth. Spoiler alert. Yes, it's the myth of Santa Claus. And so, gee, I hope that there aren't any young people watching my talk. But as Reverend Harada pointed out, Santa is an avatar for the spirit of generosity. He's upaya for the virtue known in Mahayana Buddhism as dana, or selfless giving. Furthermore, Reverend Harada was betting that because it's such a heartwarming myth, the Santa Claus myth will probably outlast the popularity of any of our historically real cultural heroes, such as our current A-list movie stars. And then the second example of an avatar is one that I personally think deserves more airtime. Yes, it's Smokey the Bear. So, even though California has been suffering lately from devastating forest fires, I haven't been seeing Smokey on TV. And I wonder if maybe he was, retired because he's a little too, shall we say, old school. But in the poster, you can see his unforgettable mantra, only you can prevent forest fires. And Smokey is an avatar that expresses, I think, a sincere appreciation of the wonderful gift of our forests. And being a bear, Smokey is one with nature. He's a forest dweller himself, and he really appreciates it as his home. As I remember when I was a young kid growing up, he would often emphasize how important it was for campers to be, careful with campfires. I really think his deeper message was encouraging us to not take our forests for granted, because they and all the wildlife that live within them are fragile and precious. So this concept of avatars, why they are important and what they embody, I think is the basic focus of my talk today. But of course, we'll be concentrating on the avatars or upaya of Pure Land Buddhism. But before we get more into the development of Pure Land Buddhism, I think we need just a little bit of background information about Pure Land Buddhism. I'm sorry, not Pure Land Buddhism, but Sakyamuni Buddha, the historical Buddha who had the awakening to what we call the Buddha Dharma in approximately the 5th century before the Common Era. And the reason why I think we need background information on Sakyamuni Buddha is because the development of Pure Land Buddhism actually took place several centuries after his awakening. And the development of Pure Land Buddhism could not have happened without Shakyamuni's first having attained awakening. So regarding the Buddha, according to the early accounts of the Buddha's life, on the night of his awakening, he meditated deeply on the question of who or what he really was and why. At the age of 35, he found himself at a point of desperation. As I think you all know, he'd left his family's palace in search of the solution to the problem of aging, illness, and death. But after 6 years of yogic meditation and extreme asceticism, he still had not found a lasting solution. But that night, he sat beneath a Bodhi tree and he remembered, a beneficial experience he'd had as a child in quiet meditation. And so he began once again to meditate. And it's said in these early accounts that in the beginning stages of his meditation, Sakyamuni reflected on the suffering of all living beings around him. But then a key point came when he began to look closely at the underlying patterns of thought within his own mind. And so in other words, he switched from an external focus to a deep internal and psychological self-examination. And in his self-examination, Sakyamuni realized what is known as the principle of dependent arising. Throughout his life, he'd always assumed that all the feelings, all the thoughts, all the perceptions he experienced essentially proved the existence of a self, a unique identity that not only made him separate from all other selves, but that this self-identity was also permanent. But that night, his earth-shattering insight was that it was actually this assumption or actually delusion about his so-called self that was actually responsible for his suffering. So the Buddha saw that this belief in a separate permanent self is what actually creates our difficulty. Why? Because it's out of sync with the way things really are. And the way things really are, according to the Buddha, is expressed in this principle of dependent arising. In the constant flow of impermanence, all things arise dependent on other things. Therefore, all things are also empty of an independent self-nature. So in his deep meditation, it's said that the Buddha was able to literally unravel his mistaken assumptions and gain release from his self-caused suffering. He saw that all those feelings, all those thoughts, all those perceptions he thought were his had actually arisen instead from the constantly changing causes and conditions of his life. The Buddha attained enlightenment, the bliss of nirvana. And now, I think some of you, or maybe many of you, know that dependent arising, this teaching of dependent arising, is itself closely aligned with two core Buddhist teachings. Dependent arising says that everything arises dependent on other things. And so therefore, there can be no such thing as an independent permanent self. And so this negation, denial of an independent permanent self, is the core Buddhist teaching known as no self. Or non-self, but in this talk, I'll just use the term no self. I think many of you know that the people in the time of the Buddha believed in a persisting self or soul that was constantly reincarnated after one's physical death. But the Buddha's teaching denied this. And so the teaching of no self was a extremely radical teaching in his time. But actually, it still is. It still is a very radical teaching. And then in addition, the teaching of no self follows from the Buddha's realization of constant flow or impermanence. If as impermanence states, if everything is constantly moving, if everything is constantly flowing, if everything is constantly changing, then this also includes what we think of as our permanent self, which is, of course, not so permanent. And so the Buddha taught that the solution to the great problem of aging, illness, and death is just to see each moment as it comes into being. And in each moment, see that all is impermanent, all is flowing, all is moving, all is changing, and that nothing is separate, nothing is independent. And this is, seeing things the way they really are. And the Buddha taught that this seeing breaks the attachment that we have to our so-called self, which is the true cause of our suffering. Now, of course, the difficulty here is to become aware of our self-attachment. That's easier said than done. And so, by the way, I think this is why all Buddhist traditions that I'm aware of, all Buddhist traditions emphasize some form or another of internal mindfulness practice. And in our Pure Land tradition, our practice is often referred to as Nenbutsu, or the recitation of Namo Amida Butsu. But I think Namo Amida Butsu also has a deeper, more introspective meaning, which is mindfulness or Nen of the Buddha, or Butsu. I think we'll see later that these words, Namo Amida Butsu, are also quite significant in regards to this focus that we have on avatars. But now, in the Buddha's lifetime of teaching, it's said he gave thousands of unique teachings. But, I think we should never lose sight of this basic insight we've discussed into the nature of our suffering, which, as he taught, the nature of our suffering was self-caused. Even at his death, on his deathbed, the Buddha was still urging his followers to, be lamps unto yourselves and diligently follow his teachings and their self-caused suffering. And I think, quite poignantly, he pointed out how his own death was itself illuminating the truth of impermanence. But eventually, in the centuries following the death of the Buddha, there came to be a large group of followers who broke away from the early Sangha, and this large group of followers began to refer to themselves as the Mahayana. Why did the Mahayana break away? That's the question. Well, there are various, I think, somewhat differing accounts by scholars of Buddhism. I'm not a scholar of Buddhism, but I've read several accounts, various accounts, and they vary somewhat about the developments that led these Buddhist followers to break away from the early, more conservative Sangha. This is the Sangha that would eventually become known as the Theravada. So the Mahayana broke away from the Theravada or the elders. But one thing that all scholars seem to agree on is that the Mahayana followers would not have broken away without a compelling reason, right? And in the case of the Mahayana, it seems that they were dissatisfied with the Buddhism of the elders. Essentially, they saw the Theravada's interpretation of the Buddha's awakening as being, maybe this sounds a little strange, but as being limiting, as being exclusive and not inclusive. This is why the Mahayana self-described themselves as Mahayana, or great vehicle. So let's see, let me go on to discuss the concern of the Mahayana. So one of the primary concerns of the Mahayana was their feeling that although the Buddha's teaching of dependent arising was indeed a truly profound and radical teaching, the Theravada's interpretation of it as primarily being the way to end one's suffering and attain nirvana did not capture the deeper spiritual essence of Sakyamuni's awakening. So according to some scholars, the Mahayana saw the Theravada's single-minded focus on following the Buddha's teachings as having become, I guess, perhaps inadvertently, a kind of self-centered goal. In other words, the primary question of the Theravada became, how do I escape from the suffering of samsara to the bliss of nirvana? But in contrast to the conservative Theravada, the Mahayana were very creative in their efforts to clarify the deeper essence of Sakyamuni's awakening. And in discovering this deeper essence, they established innovative ways of reinterpreting the Buddha's teachings. So according to some scholars, the most important of these innovations was a critical shift in the Mahayana's focus. So on the one hand, they retained the basic Theravada understanding of the Buddha's enlightenment as having resulted from his insight into dependent arising. And they acknowledged that this insight led to his experience of nirvana, to his liberation from his self-caused suffering. I mean, clearly, if there's no self or no self-attachment, then there's no self-caused suffering, right? However, in the Mahayana, there was a shift from this initial insight, even as critical as it was. So instead of asking the Theravada's question, which was, how do I escape from samsara to nirvana? The Mahayana asked, what was the true reason for the Buddha's insight into dependent arising? What was the true reason for his insight? And the key innovation of the Mahayana was to realize that the deeper reason for the Buddha's insight was to be of benefit to all sentient beings, not just to be for one's own benefit. I think you've all heard the term bodhisattva, right? Bodhisattva is a sattva or sentient being with the mind of bodhi or awakening. However, I think you may also know that while the Theravada think of a bodhisattva as a Buddha to be, or in other words, as someone on the way to being a fully awakened Buddha, but someone who is not yet there. But in contrast to that, in Mahayana Buddhism, a bodhisattva has a different meaning. A Mahayana bodhisattva is a sentient being with bodhichitta. In Sanskrit, bodhi means awakening, and chitta means mind. For the Mahayana, bodhicitta refers to the wish to attain awakening, not just for oneself, but for the benefit of all beings. This was an extremely important Mahayana doctrinal innovation. The Mahayana placed special significance not on the Buddhas actually having attained nirvana, which the Theravada tended to portray as his, his escape from or his ending of samsara, but instead on the arising of the Buddha's bodhicitta. So in other words, though all Buddhists are, of course, seeking enlightenment or nirvana, as one Mahayana scholar, Dr. Alan Sponberg has pointed out, a Mahayana bodhisattva realizes, let me show you Dr. Sponberg's quote. Oh, I'm sorry. Wait a minute. The most crucial and decisive point on the path is when one realizes their wish to attain awakening is not just for themselves, but for the benefit of all beings. This is the crucial turning point on the path, the point at which the aspirant realizes that he or she is seeking enlightenment, not simply as a personal goal, but for the sake of all sentient beings. This shift of the Mahayana from focusing on Sakyamuni's attainment of nirvana to the arising within him of bodhicitta illustrates why scholars, Mahayana scholars state that, after Sakyamuni Buddha himself, the single most important event in Buddhist history was the rise of the Mahayana. I think you can see why Mahayana scholars say that, and Theravada scholars do not think that way necessarily. So interestingly, this Mahayana emphasis on the Buddha's bodhicitta also explains why the Buddha did not, remain under the Bodhi tree, after he attained enlightenment, why he did not remain under the Bodhi tree in this state of nirvanic bliss. Dr. Nobuo Haneda and other Jodo Shinshu scholars like, I think Dr. Susumu Yamaguchi also has said this, have clarified that although Sakyamuni Buddha did awaken to dependent arising, yes, he did awaken to dependent arising, we've just discussed, but it was not his understanding of dependent arising as no self, as radically important as that is, that was actually responsible for him getting up and going out and dedicating 45 years of his life to sharing his teachings. Instead, it was his seeing a deeper significance in the truth of dependent arising. So as we've learned earlier, dependent arising says that in the constant flow of impermanence, all things arise dependent on other things. Therefore, all things are also empty of an independent self nature. And the deeper meaning here, according to the Mahayana, is that if all things arise dependent on other things and are empty of any independent self nature, then all things are also interdependent. I think you can probably see the relationship between the teachings of impermanence and no self that we discussed earlier and this teaching of interdependence. Because I think we could say that an appreciation of interdependence follows naturally from an understanding of impermanence and no self. Because as dependent arising says, in the constant flow of impermanence, everything arises dependent on other things. And therefore, there is no such thing as an independent self. So I think you can see the relationship between interdependence and dependent arising as no self and impermanence. In the awakened view of the Buddha, we are not actually separate selves, but are all living interdependent, interconnected lives, all part of the same flow of impermanence. And so, it was specifically the Buddha's deeper understanding of dependent arising as also indicating the interdependence and interconnectedness of all life that actually led to his arising of bodhichitta, and that inspired him to go out and share the teaching of dependent arising. So I'd like to share with you a really memorable one-liner from Dr. Nobuo Haneda. Dr. Haneda said, whereas in Theravada Buddhism, a bodhisattva becomes a Buddha, in Mahayana Buddhism, a Buddha becomes a bodhisattva. So I'd like to now transition to a discussion of that focuses on how the Mahayana went about sharing their understanding of the importance of the Buddha's bodhicitta. The realization that one actually attains awakening for the benefit of all beings. So not surprisingly, it was precisely this insight into Sakyamuni's bodhicitta that also inspired them to compose new sutras, new stories that could represent the significance of this arising of bodhicitta. And perhaps most importantly, effectively inspire the arising of bodhicitta in everyone. And by the way, this Mahayana dedication to inspiring everyone's bodhicitta is, I think, why the Pure Land tradition is in fact a universal tradition, because all that's required is to listen to and sincerely reflect on these teachings. So as we've learned, the primary motivation for the Mahayana breaking away from the Theravada was to discover what they regarded as being Sakyamuni's deeper spiritual essence, which was his arising of bodhicitta. And around the beginning of the Common Era, according to most scholars, I think, around the beginning of the Common Era, the first Mahayana sutras began to appear. And one of these early sutras happens to be the main sutra of our Pure Land tradition, which is the largest sutra. And, in the various accounts of the development of Mahayana and Pure Land Buddhism, another important Mahayana innovation was something that I discussed a little earlier, which was, their use of avatars or upaya. The Mahayana used these avatars or upaya as stand-ins, right, for the ultimate truth reality or dependent arising that Sakyamuni Buddha awoke to. And as we'll see a little later, I think there are really profound reasons for their use of upaya or avatars. But I think, even now we can sense that, if the Mahayana were intent on giving effective expression to the significance of bodhicitta, expression that was sufficient to cause the arising of bodhicitta within everyone reading or hearing their sutras, then they absolutely needed to find creative and imaginative means to express it. And they also had to account for its arising, because bodhicitta doesn't just arise by itself. As we saw in Sakyamuni Buddha's own story, it arose upon his deepening understanding of dependent arising as not only impermanence and no self, but as also reflecting the inherent interconnectedness and oneness of all life. And so, to make something, relatable to everyday people, it had to be a story involving people. But at the same time, the people in these sutras or stories were people or sentient beings who had extraordinary experiences or encounters. These were not encounters with mundane problems, but these were transformative encounters with awakened beings, transformative encounters with inspirational Buddhas, And ultimately, this story that they're creating, of course, also clearly needed to somehow embody the ultimate truth and reality itself, which we've already defined as dependent arising. And now here, let me, apologize for using what might be difficult terms for some of you. But there's another term for this ultimate truth. And in the next segment, I'm going to discuss the largest sutra specifically, and there's an important commentary on it that I want to discuss. And in this commentary, there's another term that's used along with dependent arising. So let me mention it now. The term is Dharmakaya or Dharma body. Actually, before you kind of freak out and say not another term, but the scholar Dr. Mark Blum clarified that the word Dharma in Dharmakaya simply refers to the same ultimate truth and reality or dependent arising that we've already discussed. So this isn't really it's not another truth, it's just another term. And basically the Mahayana used this term, Dharmakaya or Dharma body, I think in order to clarify that this ultimate truth, dependent arising, can manifest in various ways, one of which is that it can manifest in human beings, like Sakyamuni Buddha. That's why they use the term Dharmakaya. And by the way, I'm not sure, if I've lost everyone or if you're still with me, but, we needn't worry, I think, about exactly what this ultimate reality is. I mean, we can think about it and we should understand it, its definition and conceptually. I mean, we already discussed Shakyamuni's awakening to the reality of impermanence and no self. And I think maybe especially, the Mahayana emphasis on interdependence. But I think to truly grasp ultimate reality, wouldn't we have to consider the interconnectedness of not only all the events of our lives, but all the events of all life throughout all time? In other words, infinite life. It's kind of a tall order, I think you would agree. But what I think we can understand is that this Dharmakaya or dependent arising is in fact always at work in our lives, and that it can lead to our bodhichitta, to us aspiring to work for the awakening of all beings. Also, in any case, in the largest sutra, the largest sutra is a Mahayana sutra. And so being a Mahayana sutra, these extraordinary, auspicious elements, including sentient beings, encounters with awakened beings, and the use of avatars as expressions of ultimate truth and reality, all these things are found in abundance in the largest sutra, which is why it's difficult to read and comprehend. Now, as I alluded to a little earlier, there, I think, is a profound reason why the Mahayana employed avatars or upaya as stand-ins, so to speak, for ultimate truth, for dependent arising that Sakyamuni Buddha awoke to. And here, I'd like to discuss one of the most important later Mahayana thinkers. This is the Chinese Buddhist teacher and the third of the 7 Pure Land masters, Tanwan, who lived in the 6th century of the Common Era. By the way, most of this material is from Professor Shojun Bando. Some of you may know Shojun Bando was an influential teacher at Otani University. And so like his fellow Mahayanists, Tanwan was familiar with the concept of the Dharmakaya as the ultimate truth of dependent arising. But he was also, I think, very sensitive to its being very difficult to express in words. And in addition, he had a masterful understanding of the use of upaya or avatars. And he felt that if people are unable to understand concepts like dependent arising, then the best way to express this truth is to use some form of a symbol or metaphor, some form of upaya or avatar. But Tanwan made a highly influential contribution to Mahayana Buddhism when he also clarified that there are actually two aspects to ultimate reality or Dharmakaya. Here I've slightly edited his statement for clarity. Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are made up of twofold Dharmakaya. Dharmakaya in its aspect of ultimate reality, and Dharmakaya in its upaya aspect. Out of the former, the latter appears. By way of the latter is the former realized. Though distinct from each other, these two aspects of Dharmakaya are inseparable. Though they are one, they should never be confused. In other words, if we understand the profound truth that the upaya or avatars of Pure Land Buddhism represent, they are inseparable from and not lesser than the Dharmakaya they represent. They are simply the dynamic, expressive, and creative aspect of truth. I could say, of course, going back to the examples of Smokey the Bear and Santa, Santa's upaya for this wonderful quality of dana or selfless giving, and Smokey is an avatar for the wonderful ideal of sort of appreciation and oneness with nature, right? But maybe a little bit closer to home in terms of your temple home, the statue of Amida Buddha in your temple's altar, is not the same as the Dharmakaya it represents, but it's no less significant. And then also Tanwan clarified, not surprisingly, that the Pure Land itself, what we call the Pure Land or refer to as the Pure Land, is also upaya and represents ultimate truth itself. So therefore, according to Tanwan, the common phrase birth in the Pure Land actually means birth in or awakening to dependent arising. But one thing that I think is especially profound is Tanwan's statement that we heard earlier, that though they are one, though the Dharmakaya and the upaya that represent it, though they are one, they should never be confused. They should never be confused. And so I think what Tanwan is clarifying is the non-duality of Dharmakaya and upaya. They are both different and same. Before we leave Tanwan, I'd like to share with you one other truly thought-provoking, I guess what I would call a Tanwanism, if you will. And this is something that's in his writing. So Tanwan says that if bodhisattvas do not understand this non-duality, or in other words, this interdependence of the Dharmakaya and upaya, if they don't understand this, they unfortunately will not be able to benefit either themselves or others. Their practice will be ineffective. So this is a very profound statement, and actually discussing actually what I guess we could call Tanwan's warning, his warning, right? It's beyond the scope of my talk today, but I do hope that we can reflect on its far-reaching implications, in regards to the future of our tradition and our institutions. I think Tanwan is encouraging us to deeply understand the non-duality of the Dharmakaya and upaya, because it's only then that they can both manifest naturally and creatively and effectively in our Pure Land tradition. And I've said this in other talks, but the implication for us as American Shin Buddhists is that in understanding this non-duality of the Dharmakaya and upaya, this non-duality of dependent arising and the avatars for it, then virtually unlimited creative possibilities open up for us as new ways to share the Buddhist teachings. Okay, so now that we've looked at the Mahayana's emphasis on bodhicitta and their deep understanding of upaya or avatars, let's look specifically at Bodhisattva Dharmakara's story in the largest sutra. So first, as we know, the largest sutra is a mythical story. But as I think we'll recognize, the story also has a universal significance. As my lecture's title states, Bodhisattva Dharmakara is the avatar of the Pure Land. And this is because his story expresses the arising of bodhicitta. As we'll see, his story also expresses the fulfillment of bodhicitta as well, because in the sutra, Dharmakara becomes Amida Buddha and presides over the Pure Land, the awakened land or realm where all who are born there are permeated with the spiritual essence of bodhicitta. So the larger sutra tells the story of Dharmakara, the seeker Dharmakara, who was originally a king, but whose bodhicitta was kindled by encountering a great Buddha named Lokeshvara. Since Lokeshvara, as a Buddha, has the same qualities as all Buddhas, in other words, he radiates the same Dharmakaya or ultimate truth. He therefore inspires Dharmakara to renounce his kingdom, become a Buddha himself, and seek to save all beings from samsara by establishing the Pure Land. This is, of course, according to the Mahayana, the key turning point for Dharmakara that marks the arising of his bodhicitta. Here's a passage from the larger sutra that describes Dharmakara's meeting with the Buddha Lokeshvara. When Dharmakara meets Lokeshvara, he requests guidance on how he can become a Buddha himself. But despite Dharmakara's request, Lokeshvara at first declines, saying, "You yourself should know by what practice you can establish a glorious Buddha land." But then, sensing something deeper, sincere, and undeniable in Dharmakara, Lokeshvara gave detailed and inspiring instructions. As the larger sutra puts it, the Buddha Lokeshvara, realizing how deep and vast was the noble aspiration of this monk, immediately delivered a teaching for the monk. Dharmakara's aspiration to become a Buddha leads him to then establish vows. Vows to bring all beings to Buddhahood, or to use the terms of the sutra, to allow or to have all beings be born in the Pure Land, in the land or the realm of bliss or nirvana. And there are 48 vows, but the 18th of these vows is considered to be the most essential or primal vow. In this vow, Dharmakara states that unless his vow is fulfilled for all sentient beings, he himself will not become a Buddha. I think you can see here the characteristic Mahayana emphasis here on interdependence, and of course on bodhicitta, on the wish to work for the benefit of all beings. The wording of Dharmakara's vow implies that because all life is interdependent, Dharmakara's own Buddhahood is in fact dependent on everyone's Buddhahood. Obviously there can't be any such thing as a private Pure Land. As we learned in this constant flow of impermanence, all life is interconnected, and in essence, all life is one. Dharmakara is the quintessential avatar of the essential bowing, listening, and practice. Bowing and listening practice. And we'll see this in the sutra. And as the quintessential avatar, this is why we need an avatar to inspire us. But eventually, after a very long and dedicated and sincere practice, Dharmakara fulfills his vow. He establishes the Pure Land and becomes Amida Buddha. But then how does Dharmakara fulfill his vow, which as we know is the great vow, the primal vow, to lead all beings to Buddhahood? Well, Dharmakara's Bodhisattva practice, what he practices in order to fulfill his vow, is another significant aspect of Pure Land Buddhism. In one of the chapters in the larger sutra, Dharmakara's practice is described, and it's essentially called a visitation practice. So in other words, he goes out, he makes offerings to, he bows to, and he learns from innumerable beings. And so really, rather than fulfilling his ambitious vow through some kind of, mystical power or, petitionary prayer, he fulfills his vow by humbly bowing to all beings, by deeply listening to and receiving what they teach him. And ultimately, he perfects his bowing listening practice to such an extent that he literally appreciates all beings as teachers, all beings as Buddhas. And so as Dr. Netta has pointed out, in this sense, attaining Buddhahood changes him, not others. And most significantly, I think as you may know, Amida Buddha's full name is Namu Amida Butsu. And since Namu means taking refuge or bowing, Dr. Haneda has pointed out that his name can be translated as bowing Amida Buddha. Namu Amida Butsu, bowing Amida Buddha. So in other words, his bowing practice is reflected in his very name. And I think you can see here the deep meaning in the words Namu Amida Butsu. As we've seen, these words not only reflect the full name of Mida, but also the bowing and listening practice that fulfilled Dharmakara's great Bodhisattva vow. And so actually here, it might be good to review Tanwan's earlier statement about the twofold Dharmakaya. But to help make Tanwan's point a little clearer, I'm going to paraphrase his statement. And then also remembering, I pointed out that Dr. Mark Blum clarified that the words Dharma and Dharmakaya are essentially interchangeable. So that being the case, I'm going to just substitute the word Dharma here for Dharmakaya. So to paraphrase Tanwan's statement on the twofold Dharmakaya, it's out of the Dharma that Namu Amida Butsu appears. And it's by way of Namu Amida Butsu that the Dharma is realized. If we deeply hear and understand the deep meaning of Amida's full name, which is Namu Amida Butsu, we too will attain awakening. In the language of Pure Land Buddhism, we too will attain birth in the Pure Land. We too will become imbued with Amida's essence, which, to again quote Dr. Netta, is an ever-expanding spirit. So Dharmakara, the quintessential avatar of the Pure Land, shows us that in order to attain awakening ourselves, we must have our own bodhicitta, our own aspiration kindled, and then fulfill that aspiration through our own bowing and listening practice. Okay, so to conclude my talk here, I'd like to share a memorable and I think really remarkable statement by one of the great scholars of our Pure Land tradition. This is the late Dr. Alfred Bloom. Dr. Bloom once said, "Unless one practices Buddhism with the intention of benefiting others, they cannot fulfill their own awakening." What does Dr. Bloom's statement mean? I mean, does it mean that, well, as long as we consciously practice Buddhism with the intention of benefiting others, that then we will automatically fulfill our own awakening? No, I don't think so. I think a key word in Dr. Bloom's statement is the word intention. So this intention to benefit others arises in us not because of any conscious decision we make for our own benefit. It arises because through the inspiration we receive from our teachers, we gain insight into the truth of the way things really are, which is that our life is inextricably interconnected and interdependent with all other life. This is exactly the same transformative insight that the Mahayana understood Sakyamuni Buddha to have, and which gave rise to his bodhichitta, and which led the Mahayana to compose the story of Bodhisattva Dharmakara in the larger sutra. If we deeply hear, if we deeply understand and are transformed by this essential Buddhist truth, by our interconnectedness with all life, then we too will naturally be inspired to work for the benefit of others. So with this clarification, I hope that Dr. Bloom's powerful statement comes into focus. As he'd said, quote, "Unless one practices Buddhism with the intention of benefiting others, they cannot fulfill their own awakening." He's saying that what awakening really is actually the arising within us of the wish to work for the awakening of others. As we learned earlier, the Mahayana clarified that it wasn't Shakyamuni's attainment of nirvana, but the arising of bodhicitta within him that was his true awakening, and which revealed his deeper spiritual essence. Dharmakara's story powerfully illustrates this arising of bodhicitta. This is why Dharmakara is the avatar of the Pure Land. This intention to benefit others is absolutely essential for our own awakening. In fact, this is our awakening. Thank you very much for listening. That's the end of my lecture. Namo Buddhaya.